know for sure is that Putin has no intention of accepting anything like that. Putin has been very consistent since the start of the war. He wants everything. And if he doesn't get everything, he doesn't want to stop.
Hi, I'm Maddie, Hale, and welcome to Times Radio's The Trump Report. Today, we've spoken to Sir Bill Browder about Vladimir Putin's comments that he won't meet with Vladimir Zelensky to potentially broker a peace deal, despite the fact that Donald Trump says he can get these two to the bargaining table, and he will try and do that potentially by placing further sanctions on Russia. So we're going to speak to him about that and why he wouldn't do this with Joe Biden, why Joe Biden and Russian President Vladimir Putin didn't speak throughout the Biden administration. So all that plus an update on what is going on in the war. North Korea is sending more artillery to Russia to help them out. So there's a lot happening in the Russia-Ukraine war today. So, Bill Browder, thank you so much for your time today. The latest on the conflict going on with Russia and Ukraine is, of course, that Putin has refused to hold any sort of resolution talks with Volodymyr Zelensky. I want your thoughts on this outright refusal to meet.
Well, I think we need to take a step back and understand why Putin is in Ukraine in the first place. He's not in Ukraine because he has any sort of formal objectives to take over eastern Ukraine. He's not in Ukraine because of NATO. He's in Ukraine because he's been a dictator in power for now 25 years. And he views war as a way of staying in power. In other words, if he can create a foreign enemy, then people won't be looking at all the problems inside Russia and blaming him. And this is, by the way, standard Machiavelli 101 dictator playbook. And so all of a sudden, he's in this situation where a new president comes into the United States, Donald Trump. Donald Trump has this campaign promise that he's going to end the war in 24 hours. And Donald Trump says he wants to get everybody to the table to negotiate. And so Putin's got to find a way out. And so his way out is to say, well, I can't negotiate with Zelensky. Of course, I'm willing to negotiate, just not with that guy. And so, put a condition on the negotiations, and all of a sudden, he doesn't have to do what he doesn't want to do. He doesn't want to end the war. Putin wants to keep at this war, as bad as it is, because he needs to win this war in order to justify why he went in the first place.
And it's interesting because Donald Trump's whole, I guess, thing is that he can get these two together to negotiate this peace deal. But how do you even get a peace deal done if one party isn't actually present to veto or to claim what Ukraine wants?
Well, I mean, first of all, it's not a negotiation if Ukraine's not involved, and that's a non-starter. I think Trump understands that. He, in some of the very first words after his inauguration, he said Zelensky is ready to negotiate. I'm not sure if Putin is. Putin's got all sorts of economic problems and losing soldiers, and so Trump is pretty much defined the negotiation as a negotiation between three parties: the United States, Ukraine, and Russia. He's acknowledged that Ukraine is ready to negotiate, and now he's seeing that Putin's not ready to negotiate. And of course, Donald Trump also made the statement, I think 2 days after his inauguration, in Truth Social, that if Putin isn't going to negotiate, then he's going to impose what he calls taxes, tariffs, and sanctions on Russia. And so the scene has been set actually a lot more positively than I would have imagined before all this happened. Of course, I don't want to project too much into the future because it's all impossible to predict when you have Donald Trump as president. But what I can say is that Putin is the one who's looking obstinate right now. However he defines his unreasonableness, it's clear that he's the one not negotiating.
The thing on these threats, though, Bill, from Donald Trump, saying that he will impose sanctions and he'll impose tariffs on Russia if Vladimir Putin doesn't come to the bargaining table, basically. But the US and Russia aren't massive trading partners. Russia's not even in the top 15 of the United States as trading partners. So I wonder how big of a threat or how even much of a dent will this even place on Putin when he's thinking about whether to actually come to the table?
Well, Donald Trump has a lot more power than just what the U.S. is buying from Russia. If Donald Trump wants to make life difficult for Vladimir Putin, he could do so very easily by just, for example, imposing sanctions on all the Indian, Chinese, and Turkish oil refineries that are buying Russian oil. If he did that, they wouldn't buy the Russian oil, and there'd be no buyers for the Russian oil. And all of a sudden, 6 months from now, Putin would have no money. So Trump has an enormous amount of power here if he chooses to use it, and it's a game of chicken at the moment between Trump and Putin to see who's going to blink first.
Does everything come down, in your opinion, Bill, to the Russian economy? Do the chips lie basically in the economy on Putin's legacy, or I guess how he stands with the Russian people, that the economy is dwindling? He's obviously funneled a lot of money into this war. And if it looks like the United States are placing more sanctions, more tariffs, or whatever it may be on Russia, it doesn't look good for him in the eyes of the Russian people.
Well, I wouldn't overstate the importance of the Russian people in determining how Putin behaves. Putin is a dictator. He doesn't care about what Russian people think. He doesn't care that he's lost 825,000 Russian soldiers. He doesn't care about the economic damage that he's done. Putin only cares about one thing, which is himself. He cares about staying in power, because if he wasn't in power, then he'd go to jail, lose his money, and get killed. And so what you have here is a very little man who's scared of dying, who will do anything to keep himself alive, even if that means millions of Russians dying, millions of Ukrainians dying. And so we shouldn't think anything about public opinion in Russia. Now, there's two things that can determine the outcome of this war. One is if he runs out of money, he just can't fight the war. And the second is if the Ukrainians run out of money, then even with limited resources, the Russians can overtake Ukraine. And so what that means is that the United States and the other Western allies, the EU, the UK, need to continue funding the Ukrainians on a military basis. And what it means is that if Donald Trump is sincere about imposing sanctions, that he does so in a way that really hits Putin's pocketbook. And the one sort of massive loophole that Putin has been exploiting is the sale of oil. That's what keeps him going. If the oil stops, or the money stops from the oil, then Putin's out of business.
Absolutely. Bill, I want to read a quote to you from Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov, who said that so far we have not received any signals from the Americans. Russia's readiness remains, and the same readiness as far as we have heard remains on the American side. Apparently a certain amount of time is required. I'm just wondering, why is it now that Russia and the Kremlin have decided that they're ready to talk?
Well, as you pointed out at the beginning of our conversation, they're not ready to talk. They throw up all sorts of conditions and nonsense to say we're ready to talk, but we're not ready to talk. And for what it's worth, I've been involved in many high level conflicts in Russia with oligarchs and with Putin himself, and it's a standard Russian negotiating procedure to say, "Oh, we're totally reasonable. We're ready to talk. It's just these other guys that are not ready to talk." And this is what they do in every negotiation where they have no intention of talking. And so I think that it's dishonesty on a level that we don't really understand in the West, because they just do that as a matter of daily life action, just always lying. And when it comes to negotiations, they do that, and it comes to every other part of business, they do that.
When this phone call does take place between Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump, when Trump says it's imminent, it's basically meant to be in the first few weeks of his presidency, how do you actually see that phone call going?
Well, I think that what Donald Trump is going to try to do is to create some type of peace conference. He's going to say, "Okay, Vladimir, I want you to come to Geneva or Reykjavik, or someplace like some country like that, where I'll sit down with you and Zelensky, and we will sit in a room and cut a deal." He wants to do a deal. He's a deal guy. And so will Putin agree to that? Will he not? Will he push it off further? I don't know. But even if they end up sitting in a room somewhere, it depends on what's discussed in that room. And I'm reasonably convinced that whatever Trump and his team have come up with, and we've seen some of the contours of a Trump peace plan, and those are along the lines of the fighting stops where it is right now, that Ukraine doesn't join NATO, that European peacekeepers come in. That's Trump's sort of the contours of a peace plan that he's sort of leaked out there. But what I know for sure is that Putin has no intention of accepting anything like that. Putin has been very consistent since the start of the war. He wants everything, and if he doesn't get everything, he doesn't want to stop. And that's the real problem here: is that Putin doesn't want to stop because he can only stop if he achieves his own maximalist objectives, and those objectives are not going to be acceptable to Trump because it would make Trump look weak. He'd look like a loser, and he'd basically be doing what to Ukraine, what Biden did to Afghanistan, and it will be a mark on his legacy forever.
As it was to Biden. Bill, I'm wondering about the language and the rhetoric that the Kremlin have used when they speak, or I guess Putin when he speaks about Donald Trump. He praises Trump in the way he is as a president. He agrees with him that the 2020 election was rigged. He uses very complimentary language. My question, I guess, is it manipulative? Is it what's in it for Putin when he uses this praise on Donald Trump?
Well, it's very interesting how this whole dynamic has evolved because so as I said, Trump came out with this very aggressive tweet. The tweet said, if you don't do this, he made an ultimatum. If you don't come to negotiate, we're going to do all this terrible stuff, sanctions, etc. And normally that would be considered hugely disrespectful to Putin. And Putin is a guy who doesn't like to be disrespected. He doesn't like to be humiliated. And so what does he do with that? Putin considers himself to be this alpha male on steroids, and all of a sudden he's being talked down to by somebody else. Well, normally the response would be to be even more aggressive, which is what he would do in any other circumstance. But he understands that doing that would just escalate. And so what he did was he just ignored it completely. He didn't say a word about that. He has not responded to Trump's ultimatum. And then he came up with this nonsense of trying to flatter Trump, which first of all is a very weak move for a alpha male dictator. But secondly, it's something that he's done before. I can remember back in 2018 when they were sitting together in Helsinki at the Helsinki summit. There was a big thing about, so Putin showed up and he said, and actually involved me, he said, Bill Browder was funding Hillary Clinton $450 million, which was a complete lie. And therefore you should arrest Bill Browder. And the point being that he knew that Trump hated Hillary Clinton. It was right. And so he sort of figured, and Putin's not a very sophisticated guy when it comes to US politics, but you don't have to be that sophisticated to just, read what Trump cares about. He cared at that point about, Hillary Clinton, lock her up. And this time he cares about the election being stolen. And so he throws out that as like a little bit of a, scratch on the back to hope to like, as you say, manipulate Trump. I don't think Trump's so stupid, but, I'm sure at some basic level, Trump wants everybody to agree with him on that point.
Yeah, I think a lot of people would argue that Trump just wants everyone to like and respect him. But do you think that Putin sees himself a little bit in Trump?
I think that it's a totally different type of character. As you say, Trump wants to be liked. Putin doesn't care whether he's liked or not. Putin is just an absolute dictator who will kill anybody who's standing in the way. It's purely, it's not about love. It's purely about fear. Of course, Trump wants people to fear him, but he also, as you say, genuinely wants to be loved. He wants people to like him.
Mm. Bill, we spoke before about what would kind of be on the bargaining table if this conversation were to arise between Putin and Trump, and there is speculation that Trump would, I guess, agree, whether Zelensky's there or not, agree to give Russia that near 20% of Ukraine that it currently controls. What are your thoughts on that? Because that's a pretty big thing to be giving Russia if that does happen. Now, you've mentioned that Putin probably wouldn't be agreeing to anything unless it's everything. But it's a large thing to say. Okay, you can have 20% of Ukraine, the part that you already control.
Well, if you remember 80 years ago, there was a British prime minister named Neville Chamberlain. And at the time, it was Hitler wanting the Sudetenland, part of the Czech Republic. And he went there and he agreed to give him Sudetenland. And then he came back with all fanfare announcing peace in our time. And of course, um, that's not what happened. The Second World War, began in earnest shortly thereafter and led to unbelievable tragedy. You can't appease dictators. Putin is a dictator. Um, if you give him 20% of Ukraine, then he's going to move on the next 20% very soon after. And when he gets Ukraine, he's going to move on the Baltics. Putin has to have all this expansionism in order to stay in power. And so, in my opinion, one shouldn't give him anything. But I do take some comfort in knowing that Putin. I'd be very surprised if Putin accepts that, and therefore it doesn't really matter what's offered to him unless the whole thing is offered to him. And if the whole thing is offered to him, that would be the biggest disaster ever for Trump. And so I don't see why Trump would do that. And so I'm totally offended by any gift to Putin, and I think anybody who understands Putin knows that wouldn't stop him from doing what he plans to do. Um, but again, this is just the dynamics of a negotiation, which is probably not going to come to fruition, in my opinion.
Mm. Just finally, Bill, Donald Trump, he did his first his sit-down interview last week with Fox News' Sean Hannity, and he made a comment that Zelensky basically shouldn't have fought back when Russia first invaded in 2022. He said Zelensky was fighting a much bigger entity, much bigger, much more powerful. He shouldn't have done that because we could have made a deal. Now, obviously, Donald Trump wasn't the president at the time of the invasion in February 2022, but it's a large statement to be making to tell the Ukrainian president that he shouldn't have fought back.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's doesn't make any sense. I mean, Ukraine was invaded by Russia. We had a chance to see um, what Russia did when they occupied different parts of Ukrainian territory. There was a town called Bucha, which was one outside of Kiev that was occupied briefly, and all the women were raped, all the men were tortured, had their hands tied behind their backs, and then shot in the head and buried in shallow graves, and all the children were kidnapped. That's what would happen to Ukraine. That's what happened to Ukraine, and what would have happened to a lot more of Ukraine if they hadn't fought back. And so, um, I think it's a very unsympathetic statement to say that Ukraine should have just allowed this to happen. And a lot of people did try to negotiate. Olaf Scholz, the German chancellor, went to Putin before he invaded and begged him not to, and Emmanuel Macron did the same thing. Um, Putin had his own ideas, and there was nothing going to stop him from executing on those ideas. And we are where we are, not because of anybody else, but other than Vladimir Putin. And so I think that we need to be on Ukraine's side in the biggest way we could be, which is more military aid and sanctions, as Trump has pointed out. And that will be the thing that ends this war, not some type of appeasement deal, which Putin probably wouldn't accept anyways.
So, Bill Browder, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.